All right, for today, we're going to be looking at complex fractions. What complex fractions is basically a fraction of fractions. If I separate this line, let me separate that in blue, you notice that on the top I have fractions and at the bottom I have fractions. So it's a fraction of fractions. Let me take a look at my denominators. I'm looking at the denominators of each of my fractions. And let me see, I see that I have an x plus 4. I'm going to see which denominators I have. I have an x plus 4. From the second fraction, I have an x. And the x plus 4, I see that it repeats. I'm only going to write it once. So, matter of fact, let's call this least common denominator. I'm looking at the denominators, and I'm just going to copy them. But if I see them more than once, I'm only going to write them once. Okay, so let me multiply each of my fractions by my least common denominator. So in the first fraction, let me multiply this by x plus 4 and x. Second fraction, let me multiply this by x plus 4 and x. And the same thing with the fraction at the bottom. I'm going to multiply each of them by my least common denominator. I found my least common denominator by looking at my denominators, seeing which ones I had, and if I had them repeated, I only wrote them once. Okay, now what I'm going to do on my first fraction, this x plus 4 with this x plus 4 cancel out. So let me multiply x with 4x. So that's going to give me 4x squared. On my second fraction, this negative sign, let me change it to a plus sign, but give the negative sign to the 1. My x will cancel with the x. Now when I multiply negative 1 with x plus 4, that's going to give me negative x, negative 4, over, now let's take a look at the fraction at the bottom. The x plus 4 with the x plus 4 cancel out, and then that gives me 4x. Do simplify even more if all these numbers, all these coefficients, we can divide them by the same thing. In this case, we cannot. So that's as simple as I can go. All right, let's take a look at question number 2. Let me find my least common denominator. Let me take a look at my denominators. One of them is a 5. And then I also have an x plus 1. Let me multiply each of my fractions by 5 and x plus 1. All right, so looking at the first fraction, the 5s will cancel out. So I have x plus 1 times x squared plus x. We learned how to multiply it. I'm just going to do double distributive. So let me distribute the x first. It's going to give me x to the third plus x squared. All I did was distribute the x. Now let me distribute the 1. That's going to give me plus 1x squared plus 1x. Now let me take a look at the second fraction. The 5s cancel out. I have x plus 1 times x plus 1. Let me distribute the x first. So plus x squared plus x. Now let me distribute the 1. Plus x plus 1. So all that is what I have on the top. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now for the bottom, the x plus 1 with the x plus 1 cancel out, and I get 5x. All right, that was simple. Now looking on the top, let me combine my like terms. So that gives me x to the third plus 3x squared plus 3x plus 1 over 5x. Forgot to mention how to type these. Coming back to question number 1, the way you will type this would be 4x squared minus x minus 4. Notice I put it all inside parentheses. That's what we have on top. Over, at the bottom we have 4x. Once again, I put that inside parentheses. Now looking at question number 2, the way I will type this, I'm going to put the top inside parentheses, and I have x to the third plus 3x to the second plus 3x plus 1, all inside parentheses, over at the bottom 5x. Notice I was doing the little caret for the exponents. Okay, now let's take a look at question number 3. Let me take a look at the denominators. There's no denominator at the bottom. That's not a fraction, so I have no denominator. So my least common denominator, remember I was only looking at the denominators, is going to be 3 and x. Notice x, I'm only writing it once. So let me multiply each of these things by 3x, including the bottom. The bottom is not a fraction. All right, so now looking on the first fraction, my 3x with my 3x cancel out. So I have x plus 5. Looking at the bottom, my x with my x cancel out. So I have plus 9. Over, now at the bottom, I'm just going to multiply what I have. So I have 3x to the third. When I simplify this, on the top I have x plus 14. At the bottom I have 3x to the third. Once again, in order for me to simplify even more, if I could, this term, and this term, all of my terms, I have to divide them by the same thing, either by the same letter or by the same number. In this case, we cannot. So I'm just going to write down. So that's basically what we have. The way I will type this will be on the top, x plus 14. Notice I have inside parentheses, over the bottom I have 3x to the third. Lastly, let's take a look at question number 4. Looking at my denominators only, I'm going to say my least common denominator is going to be a 3 and u minus 1. Let me multiply everything by that. So I'm going to multiply this by 3 and by u minus 1. Okay, so looking at the top of my the fraction, I have no fraction, so nothing cancels out. I have 3 things. I have to multiply the 2 times the 3 times the u minus 1. Let me take a look at the first 2 parentheses only. 2 times 3. That gives me 6. And I have to multiply that with u minus 1. Notice I multiply the first 2 parentheses. Now let me multiply with the third one. So on the top I have 6u minus 6. Now let's take a look at the bottom. The 3's cancel out. U minus 1 times u minus 1, that's going to give me u squared minus u plus 1. All I did was distribute the u first. That's how I got u squared minus u. Then distribute the negative 1. That's how I got negative u plus 1. Now looking at the other fraction, the u minus 1 cancel out. So I get plus 6. That's from the 2 times 3. Notice one thing though, I do have a plus sign in between my fractions. If I ever have a minus, change it to a plus. So if this was a minus to begin with, change it to plus and give the minus to the 2. So give the negative sign. If you have a negative sign, give it to one of the terms on the top. We saw that in number 1. Okay, so coming back to number 4. Let me simplify what I can. On the top, I have 6u minus 6. Nothing I can simplify. Looking at the bottom, I have u squared minus 2u plus 7. If I have to write it, I'll just leave it like that. I will simplify more if all of my big numbers, all of them, I could divide them by the same thing. In this case, I cannot, so I cannot simplify more. Now, the way I will type this, on the top, I have 6u minus 6, close parentheses, over u squared minus 2u plus 7. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Remember my email address. You have it on Google Classroom. So